Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun.
Hello everybody, and there's somebody missing for at least part of the broadcast today, part of the Hoon today. Bernard is a little bit stuck. He's got some family issues, and he's also trying to get to the airport in order to take a flight to Europe for the next month or so. So you might be seeing a bit more of me than normal tonight. I will try not to interrupt even myself. And Bernard is going to be away for a month, but we're going to keep doing the Hoon, or he tells me we're going to keep doing the Hoon with him in Europe and me in Hoon Bay. And that's what we've essentially done in the past. And I realize I think we've been doing this nearly 4 years. So it's getting a little bit ridiculous, really. So what we're going to do on the show today is a little bit like the budget section last week, although Bernard hopefully is going to be in towards the end in order to do a soliloquy on the budget and the post-budget and what he's read and understood. I had a nice little argument with him, or not an argument, little discussion with him about a piece that Matthew Hoon wrote in the Herald about the need for New Zealand to recognise that it's actually a poor country now and not a first world country. I tend to agree with him, and I think that we need to think about that. Bernard disagreed with Matthew Hoon, and I'll come back to this when we have Bernard on towards the end, because he thinks Hoon is playing a sort of National Party game, which is don't dare borrow. New Zealand's got very good borrowing potential, but squeeze everybody on the way through. We're going to have Catherine Dyer from Victoria on in a moment to talk about climate and some really interesting and slightly alarming stories about the Paris Accord and the objectives around net zero. And also we'll talk about Woodside Petroleum in Australia launching a truly enormous expansion of its rather enormous already gas operations there. So we'll do that, and I know you all love Catherine. We've then got Robert Patman, who I know you all love, and a woman we've had before who I really like and I'm taken with journalistically, Janet Anderson, who is one half of the team. If you might remember, we had Janet and her colleague on. They have a podcast called Asymmetrical Haircuts, and they cover the Hague, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice. And one of the reasons I wanted her on is to we're going to do this a little bit like we did the budget show last week. We're going to let the international affairs today dominate. We're going to talk about the ICC. We're going to talk about the ICJ. We're going to talk about the United States sanctioning the members of the ICC or the workers at the ICC, and what that means for attempts to bring Duterte, Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course Hamas to justice. And one of the reasons I want to do this, not exactly the reason, but somebody who listens to us every week keeps messaging me on X, which I don't mind, or including me on stories about Gaza, saying, you have a platform, you need to use it to stand up for this, otherwise you're complicit. I'm not intending to be complicit, but I am an old Reuters journalist of long standing, and I'm not a campaigner, but I am as appalled as anybody with the obscene scenes there, but I'd rather tell it through the experience and information. So we'll address a lot of that in most of the show from about 5:15. And now Catherine is going to come in and talk us through her usual alarming stuff about climate. Catherine, how are you? Is it cold in Wellington? You've got a lovely sweater there.
Kia ora. It is a bit chilly. It's very rainy this evening, although I think that's the case everywhere.
Yeah. Hey, so look, there's a couple of very big stories you wanted to talk about today. And what I've realized lately in the last 5 or 6 of these is that the audience super appreciates your intelligence and thought and focus on this. Yeah, I know. Don't roll your eyes. Just take the compliment. It's true. We've had some fairly alarming reports today about the prospect of us having even warmer temperatures globally and really blowing through some of the Paris Accord limits. You want to talk about it, please, Catherine?
Yeah, the report was from the World Meteorological Association, and a lot of their forecasting for they were looking at the 5 years between 2025 and 2029. They say that it will still stay within the Paris Agreement numbers, and that's because although they forecast a very high likelihood, something like 86% of going above 1.5 degrees again in one of those years, that's still like a single year as opposed to a multi-decadal kind of run of it. The other interesting thing that they said in that report was they said for the first time they mentioned the likelihood of
breaking through 2 degrees,
over
right?
2 degrees. And they said in that report that there was a less than 1% probability of that happening, and that it would be, a one-off again if it did happen in that 5 years. And I think what's interesting about that is, to me, there was nothing particularly outrageous or interesting about this report. It's pretty much what you would expect based on the averages of where things are tracking along at the moment. We've already been past 1.5. We were 1.7 above pre-industrial times in 2024. So the likelihood that happens again sometime in the next 5 years is not particularly low. I think where it gets interesting is where there's a bit of contestation around the likelihood of these things. So James Hansen, for instance, says that the probability of going beyond 2 degrees in that 5-year period is very high, and he expects it to be consistently going above 2 degrees by the late 2030s. So that's a much, much different outlook to what the WMO are projecting. And some of that, I guess we could talk a little bit about the hot models.
Yeah, well,
scenario.
I think also, one of the aspects of this, Catherine, just re-explain again, because I know you've done it many times here, but the Paris Accords cover a very lengthy period, and what we're talking about here is is a fairly large blip, but presumably that blip can become both permanent and higher if we continue to do things like open enormous gas fields in the Northwest Shelf and drill in the United States. And we'll come back to the Woodside story when you explain this, but things are not looking good from the point of view of sustaining the push towards a lower temperature.
No, well, that's right. And I mean, in order for it to meet the Paris Agreement rules for exceeding 1.5 degrees, you're talking about climate is normally looked at over, a period of 3 decades. So it would have to be consistently over 1.5 for at least 20 years or something before it would be considered to have crossed the Paris Agreement ceiling. But, if it's consistently above 1.5 degrees for a decade, I think we kind of know. And we know that it's going consistently upwards. Then you have a pretty good idea of where things are going and that it's problematic. So I think, the fact that we are going to overshoot 1.5, that was kind of already known when the Paris Agreement was signed. It was the most likely of all of the scenarios that we would overshoot 1.5 and then somehow bring it back down before 2100. So the fact that the WMO are saying that that's going to happen again in the next 5 years, I think is supremely unsurprising. Yeah. My concern is that it will be a lot worse than what their models are suggesting.
Why do you say that? What does your thinking take you that way? Is it just is it a hunch, or you're the expert in our, you're the one who actually knows what they're talking about, which is very unusual on this show.
I'm not an expert on physical climate modelling, so I want to make that absolutely clear. I am only repeating what I've read or heard about. I wouldn't want to make predictions myself. But there is, some indications that some of the models may not be working as well as we would hope. So some quite well-known figures in climate science are kind of saying, that there have been some pretty good underestimates in the last few years of what we could expect to see. There has been the WMO uses a set of what they call coupled interrelated climate projections scenarios. So there's so that's averaging out the projections across a range of models. And a few years ago, a subset of those models, about 20% of them, started running particularly hot because they were,
as it were, yeah,
they were integrating new information on clouds and particularly on cloud formation. And because when it came to hindcasting, which is when they go back in time and get that same model to predict 10 years that have already happened, so you can see how accurate it is, they were very inaccurate when it came to hindcasting. And so the decision was made to kind of smooth out the effects of that 20% of the hot models. So they kind of moved to a meritocracy versus a democracy when it came to understanding the models. The problem with that is that the future may not look like the past. And if, as James Hansen suggests, there were some masking effects going on from aerosols and so on, then those hot models could be telling us something that we might want to be paying attention to.
And when you say aerosols, you mean aerosols, not arseholes, because the arseholes are telling us something quite different. Let me just
and
go
they're
through
a different group of people as well.
Yes. Let me just go through the World Meteorological Organization's key messages. 80% chance that at least one of the next 5 years will exceed 2024 as the warmest on record. So that's 80%. 86% chance that at least one of the next 5 years will be more than 1.5 degrees above the 1850 to 1900 average. 70% chance that 5-year average warming for 2025 to 2029, the next 4 years, will be more than 1.5 degrees. Long-term warming averaged over decades remains below 1.5, but that's good news. Arctic warming predicted to continue to outstrip global average. Precipitation patterns have big regional variations, and of course we have that. They don't talk about it, but they have the warming seas problem, which we see cropping up now every day, really, in the reality of what's in the sea, including the rather cute story today that Nemo, the little fish from Nemo, the film, manages to make itself smaller when the temperature rises over time. So everything will adapt. It's been warm before.
Yeah. Well, everything won't necessarily adapt to the amount of warming they were expecting, but there are also feedbacks and things that happen around adaptation that we don't necessarily expect that can make things better than we anticipate. So I guess you have to leave a little bit of space open for that possibility.
For hope, yeah.
Of the mini Nemos.
Yeah. And Catherine, explain why. I mean, Bernard wanted us to talk about it. I mean, I mentioned to you that many years ago I went to Woodside Petroleum in the northwest shelf of Australia, and it was one of the most incredible industrial sites I've ever seen, or extraction sites I've ever seen. Vast development, and they're going to increase the size immensely, mainly for, I think, liquefied natural gas. They do, correct, right? Which is so they'll be competing with Qatar and so on. And I think, from memory, Australia has some of the reserves that are very similar in scale to Qatar, correct?
Yeah, well, I don't know. The Australian Institute did a report on this question, and I think it's quite interesting. So first of all, I don't think it's the scale or the footprint of Woodside that they're looking to expand. It's the longevity of how long they expect to keep it running for. So they have just gotten approval from the federal government to keep running past up to 2070. Now, that was a decision that had been put off since before the election, obviously, because it's probably not particularly popular as an election issue. And according to this Australia Institute report, there's a lot of good reasons why it might not be a particularly popular decision from the point of view of the general population. So the first reason, of course, is that over that time span, according to Woodside's own estimates, it would release something like, the gas from that site would release something like 4.3 billion tonnes of CO2, which is the equivalent of opening 12 new coal-fired energy plants. And that is an estimate by Woodside. Greenpeace estimate is several degrees higher than that. So there's that. There's also the fact that the royalties from that site have declined precipitously in recent years, and a lot of that new gas is coming from sites for which there are no royalties to be paid. So how much the Western Australian government makes from all of this is something like 0.6% of their budget. There was an argument about some rock art that is being weathered or affected by toxic gas, acid gas pollution from the site, and they had applied to UNESCO for World Heritage Foundation for that rock art, and recently UNESCO has refused to give it World Heritage status on the basis that it is not significantly protected or preserved from the effect of this pollutant.
It needs to be protected, which of
the
course
other
we know
reason-
from the Rio Tinto project. Rio Tinto, the other fantastic Australian international mining company. I mean, Woodside's a mining company; it's a oil and gas company. But it destroyed, if you recall, a sacred site in northern Australia, which then led to the defenestration of its CEO. I noticed the Woodside CEO this week was saying that. And I've probably got shares in Woodside. I think somewhere in my various funds and things.
Seriously?
My daughter's going to kill me because she does ethical investing, but I only do unethical investing, not let alone the audience. But she was saying that the young in Australia are being educated to be afraid of resources and afraid of fossil fuels, and she's not going to be able to find people who are experienced and excited geologists to go and do work.
I don't know what to say about that. They've got every reason to be
get something
to be concerned about.
Probably fuck her is what you were thinking, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, the other thing that actually astounds me about this whole decision from the government is that according to the rules by which they made the decision, they were not allowed to consider the effects of climate change. Like that is not they're not even allowed to consider it, which is why the rock art thing became such a big deal, is because that was the only basis on which they could reject it. So that is clearly a big policy issue in Australia, that you can get resources approval for this sort of thing and you are not even allowed to consider the impacts.
Right. Catherine, thank you so much for staying on. And of course, stay on and listen to us, because we have Janet from The Hague. It's lovely to see you again with your asymmetrical haircut. And I've already mentioned the podcast, Asymmetrical Haircuts, and there's such a good story on the Asymmetrical Haircuts site as to why the two women behind it, two extremely experienced and effective journalists behind it, call it that. And we have our lovely usual Robert Patman, not the usual Robert Patman, our exceptional Robert Patman, Professor Robert Patman, on from Otago. Janet, it's really good to see you. How's your work going on in The Hague at the moment? Are you having difficulty?
Oh, personally, no. What's the problem? The problem is there's just so much news, and I would not say that The Hague is the centre of the world, because obviously the centre is elsewhere, but it impinges on so many of the different dramas that are going on in the world, so many of the different conflicts, that there's a constant interest in what is happening there. So makes it fun.
Yeah, Janet, but before I bring Robert in, because I think I mentioned this to you in an email, and we don't have the third person that I was hoping to have, an Auckland professor of international law, but that's fine. The reason I wanted to do this was to look at what the cases before the ICC at the moment, but then perhaps most importantly, initially, and people may not be fully aware of this because I haven't seen it reported here, but of course people have access to websites. The US attack on the ICC, the rejection of the ICC as a legitimate organization in a sense, even though the United States is of course not a partner to this, and the attacks on Karim Khan, the lead judiciary person at the ICC, and then this broader thing of requiring American companies to not support anybody who's associated with the ICC. Would you like to just explain what's going on?
Well, last Trump administration, they decided to try to sanction the then prosecutor and some members of her prosecution team. And that was mainly around the issue of Afghanistan and what US troops had done in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a member of the ICC, and it looked like they were going to look at things like black sites, the CIA rendition program, all kinds of stuff.
That would be quite exciting. Yeah,
it would have been really interesting. Now, then change of administration. Biden comes in and rescinds those sanctions. New prosecutor comes in, and part of what we assume is the deal that he made behind the scenes in order to get chosen was, I can see a way of softening this. And so he refocused that investigation and said, what's more important is the current crimes in Afghanistan. Let's not go too far back. So that meant that the ICC was in a process under Biden. We had a new war crimes ambassador. We had lots of information being shared, Ukraine, tons of money being thrown at the court, European countries getting really excited as to what this court could do. And then, again, we shift gear. Israel, Gaza, Palestine happens, and the prosecutor is under huge pressure because Palestine has become a member of the court as a result of what the UN decided that they're a state. So off the back of that, then the court said you can join. Off the back of that, they provide information to the court. Off the back of that, the prosecution has this deluge of material. There's a lot of stuff out there. Yes, there have been crimes committed. And then we have what happens in Gaza. And under huge pressure, he picks, and he does this really, in my view, strange thing of in the same announcement, in the same day, he does a few Hamas leaders who end up, being dead mainly.
Yep.
Yeah, they've all died since. And the leadership of Israel. And so you have this idea of equivalence, etc., which sets off alarm bells. It's a head of state that we have there.
But he hasn't travelled very much, has he? I mean, he's travelled to Hungary and to the United States. So he hasn't dared go to the UK
and
yet.
He's done a little bit like that, but he has travelled over airspace from different countries. Netanyahu. So we have this kind of standoff, and then Trump comes in and they do big sanctions, and they do it more cleverly this time in terms of
just
sanctions.
Say what those sanctions are, because it's so interesting that it's very precise. Just and maybe explain what that then causes for the ICC.
It's a big long text saying blah 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 about sanctions, and then they start to put at the bottom the individuals, and there's only one individual on that list at the moment, and that's Karim Khan.
Yep.
They've protected themselves against some of the challenges to the sanctions within the American courts by saying it's not against anybody who is American. But within that sanctions regime, they have said that it's anybody who provides any kind of support for the ICC in connection with the US, which doesn't really apply because the US is not a member, and US allies. Now, who are US allies? Israel. To start with. And it could be if, let's say, the ICC decided to launch something against a senior New Zealand politician.
Highly
you're
likely.
An ally
they're all bastards,
likely.
Actually, and they're committing war crimes as we speak. Yeah.
Then the US could say, "Oi, you're attacking one of our."
But really,
allies.
it's aimed at Israel, isn't it?
Totally, and
it's
means
to protect
that
Israel.
Yeah, but the implications of that are, when I started to talk Americans about sanctions, it's like what they describe it as civil death. It is civil. You cannot get a bank account. You cannot get. You cannot deal with any American institutions, and then that spreads out. So we have heads of NGOs speaking to somebody 2 days ago who said, "Yeah, I cannot anymore send any information to the ICC."
But also
as an NGO,
one of our regulars, Artie Farty 87, is telling us. Asking us so the email server, I think that was there for the ICC was a Microsoft product, like many corporations have. Karim Khan has had to move to Proton Mail, which is hosted
as many
elsewhere.
of us have. I mean, we all consider it, don't we? Do you carry on using Gmail when you know exactly what the issues are, or do you start to try and sort of insulate yourself out? But when you're talking about an institution facing this issue, they have, you imagine the thousands of documents that pour into the court every single
So
day.
how it
They're
affects the
looking at
cloud?
they're using what cloud are they using? They're using artificial intelligence to try and sort and work out whether something is interesting, not interesting. They need to automate the process and so on. Who controls all of this?
And they've had to move all of their money out of the United States, correct?
That's what we
so
understand.
This is quite. I mean, so that's a practical matter. Now, when I was going to bring Robert in a minute now, actually, but because so actually answer one question. How do you perceive, knowing what you know about the ICC, that this is going to get in the way of their investigations and their work, particularly on the Gaza case?
Well, one person said to me, which it rang very true to me, was we already knew there are very few people who've been arrested. I mean, the prison is fairly empty at the moment. There are no big trials being imagined, etc. Anyway, because they've really, they rely on cooperation to get anybody arrested.
Yes.
They have just got Duterte, so that's their big, the former president of the Philippines, so that's their big fillip, that they've got something. But apart from that, it's really quiet. And he just said to me, it will be quieter. It will get quieter and quieter. We will not have big statements. Everything will be kind of backburnered in some form or another. They'll just hope to see it, to last it out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's only 3.5 more years, isn't it?
But it's worth
more years.
It's worth thinking, though, isn't it? That I'm literally going to come to Robin now because I can see him getting aggravated because he wants to, not aggravated in the nicest possible way.
What's to join it?
The United States, Israel, North Korea, Iran, I think, and China are the main countries that are not in the ICC. Is that correct?
India, Russia.
Oh. Yeah. So, all of our best mates. Robert, one of the reasons that I love having you on for this, particularly when Janet's around and we're discussing this kind of not exactly pointy-headed, because this is where your idea of international institutions and international law becomes very real. What do you think about what you've heard? That Karim Khan can't use email, can't go to the bank, certainly can't go anywhere near the United States, and yet he's the chief prosecutor. Correct? Is that the title of the ICC?
Well, good evening, Janet, and good evening, Peter.
Thank you.
It's been fascinating.
You're so polite. Jesus.
What do I think of that? Just as a prelude, it's interesting that America has broken its own laws with regard to providing arms to a group carrying out human rights breaches. And I was going to ask Janet, did you know I think it was a legal challenge at one point to the Biden administration, but I think that's died a death, about America actually the executive breaking the country's own laws.
Just to say, it's not only the US, there's challenges in the Netherlands, in the UK, and in, I think, some other countries as well. Many countries. I mean, it's international law. You shouldn't support the commission of crimes against humanity or war crimes elsewhere. So the challenge is on.
Yeah, and even New Zealand may be providing intelligence, some military support, diplomatic support. That's something that might be explored. But
well, actually, that would be that would actually be a very low-cost way to intervene in this, wouldn't it, Robert? For New Zealand to actually say that. For New Zealand to say, we object to this, and we're forming a coalition with Australia and Pacific states to say the ICC is important.
That might be difficult. Yeah. Australia is providing significant military support, as is Germany, as is the UK, as Janet indicated. Yeah. And so, I mean, but coming back to your question about the US making life very difficult for the ICC, I mean, in the short term, I think the Trump administration will take some pride in the difficulties they're causing for the ICC. But, how this is going down with a lot of America's liberal democratic allies, you could argue that it only confirms that America is not really in a position to be a global superpower because it's too partisan in its approach. And after all, America provided a lot of the architecture for the ICC. It didn't sign up in the end, but it was for many years arguing for such a court.
It was Clinton who decided not to go in, right? Clinton decided
on sovereignty grounds.
Yes.
But, it seems to me that there will be short-term gains for the Trump administration in not paralyzing, but making ICC position very difficult. I don't think in the long term or even the medium term it will necessarily work out to America's diplomatic advantage, and it might even increase the pressures, which are beginning to develop in some quarters, to have a bit of a realignment. I was very interested in Ursula von der Leyen's observation that the West as we know it is over, and what she meant by that was she was referring to the split between America and Europe over what the situation in Ukraine, and that hasn't gone away. Everybody's desperate, particularly on the British side, to trying to keep Mr. Trump aligned with the Europeans.
Yes.
But it's maybe a nice cosmetic job, but there is a significant difference of interpretation and diagnosis of the conflict in Ukraine. So I'm wondering if the US censoring or sanctioning of the ICC plays well, of course, in the United States, but does it actually advance America's long-term interests or even medium-term interests internationally? I think there's a real question mark about that.
Yeah. Janet, sorry, do you have any response to what Robert's raised?
I understand his analysis, and I agree with it partly. What it makes me think of is how I try to understand there are so many different elements that each country is judging, is trying to pull together. If you take the position of something like New Zealand, I mean, they want to stay in something like the Five Eyes because it's of benefit to them.
Yes.
So they provide that the intelligence sharing operation. They want to carry on having you have China in your backyard. You're looking for who can help to protect. You're looking for the arms, the development of weapons. So you're juggling as a government all of these different elements. You may have a strong Jewish community who has ability to also to lobby hard on and to influence the government.
On this particular case, just let's speak
on this particular case. Yeah. I mean, I'm based in Lithuania part of the time, and I can physically feel the machinations of
the proximity
where do we
and
position ourselves. We might be part of the EU, but the EU is, I mean, you've said the West doesn't exist anymore. The EU is split into all different parts.
Ursula von der Leyen was saying that, and also in Lithuania, Russia is just right there.
Exactly. So that is part of the the pressures that governments are under. So the suggestion that somehow, I think you made it, Peter, that somehow it's easy in some way to put pressure on. They're juggling all of these different elements together.
No, absolutely.
The ICC just gets squashed as this tiny little thing in the middle. And those who are working at the ICC see it as an absolute, international law above everything. And, this is happening and therefore we must do this, and terribly righteous.
Yes.
But the governments around are juggling all of these different policy implications, whether it's local politics, international politics, etc., etc.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting. I think where Robert's coming from, and where Robert's coming from, partly in this. I'm just going to come back to you one second.
Said. I think that's very true.
Go ahead.
The juggling act is going on. My point was, I think the diagnosis or the perception of the juggling process may change, because I think many liberal democracies have been very slow to recognise the extent of the radical change that's occurred in Washington. Of course, a country like New Zealand is worried about China because it's a threat to a rules-based order, as a potential threat.
Well, let me
the problem is that the United States also is under this administration. And at the moment, there are people in our government who are pretending it's still only China's the problem, and we can go ahead intensifying. Relations can go from strength to strength, in the words of one government minister, when in fact the most important member of the Five Eyes has a territorial claim on another Five Eyes member. And
do you mean the US with Canada, or do you mean with
and also a territorial claim on another democratic ally outside the Five Eyes, which is, of course, Denmark. So this is a radical change. And also, if you're following the situation in the United States, many Americans are, constant conversations I have with my American colleagues is you outside the United States, you don't realize how quickly this administration is moving down the autocratic route,
especially
path.
when they're coming in from universities, I imagine.
Well,
did you notice today that Marco Rubio?
It's the big beautiful bill. If you saw Robert Wright's piece in the Guardian recently, where the president is seeking to quietly prevent American courts having the right, and Janet can correct me this, I understand that if a president ignores a ruling by a judge, courts in the US do have the process of being able to issue a contempt order. And there is an attempt by the administration to actually remove that constraint. That would effectively, in Robert Reich's opinion, make Trump king. So, in other words, there are efforts, actually, active efforts, to actually change the nature of the American political system.
Absolutely.
And this is going to, at some point, register with other democracies who still, because of many years, have looked to America as a country that shared their values largely and their interests. And we may be witnessing a major change in that. But yeah, I do think that many countries at the moment are behaving as if nothing has happened in Washington, and they'll just try and balance things out.
Janet, how is this affecting, or is it affecting, the International Court of Justice as well as the International Criminal Court? So just to explain to everybody, if they don't remember, that the ICC prosecutes or pursues individuals. ICJ is a more national institute, looking at it's set up by the United Nations and is looking at national complicity or national responsibility for war crimes, correct? Or breaches of international law.
Yes, it's a UN court, and it deals with states have signed up to treaties. Are they applying those treaties or not? And that can be to do with borders. It can be to do with genocide, as we've got some cases going on at the moment. South Africa,
not just in Gaza, correct?
Not just in Gaza, but we do have the big case at the moment, which is South Africa against Israel on genocide, and we saw that. I mean, the fact that South Africa has taken that position, we know is part of what was the underlying pressure on Ramaphosa inside the White House, and it wasn't directly mentioned, but it's part of the narrative. So the ICJ is a very important space in terms of the narratives, again, that states are taking against each other. But there's an American judge on the court.
Is it as vulnerable? So is the ICJ somehow less vulnerable than the ICC?
Yes, I mean, to the extent that the whole UN system is vulnerable at the moment under Trump in terms of funding and in terms of pressure. I mean, yes, of course it is vulnerable, but it has a distance from these ups and downs of different American administrations, because
and America is a signatory to the ICJ, correct?
I mean,
through the UN.
Every country that's a member of the UN is a member of the ICJ, and then they sign up to the individual treaties, and then it depends whether the ICJ is the forum.
So just to be clear, then, if I can so the ICC has issued an indictment against Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Minister of Defense and Yahya Sinwar, who's no longer with us, and the ICJ is pursuing the South African case about whether genocide has occurred or is intended by some of the Israeli actions, correct?
Yeah, the ICJ is the space where states go. In this case, South Africa went to say, look, they signed up to the Genocide Convention and they are not applying it. So we have a dispute with this country. And you can look, let's say, the Netherlands under Bashar al-Assad said, we have a dispute with Syria over their use of torture. They signed up to the Convention on Torture, and now they're torturing people, so we have a dispute with them about it. So it's all very formalistic, sort of funny language.
It's formalistic, requires You need that process in order to be taken seriously.
And they take forever. Just say the ICJ is years and years and years and years and years of backwards and forwards with very funny names like memorial and counter memorial, and it's even more icebergy than other courts, in the sense that that it's going on under the surface and we never see publicly what is happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. You weren't with us last week, but we could basically have you on every week if you'd like to come up and get up this early. But we had I referred last week to Philippe Sands because he was here for the international human rights lawyer and amazing author, because he was here for the Auckland Writers Festival, and these questions of genocide, the law of genocide. I was looking, for example, at the Lemkin Institute today, which is named after the person who created the concept of genocide. And Philippe Sands, their point, if they're lawyers, is it doesn't matter almost when something is taken up; it's that it's going to be taken up, it's going to be addressed, which can seem, to our audience and to anybody watching what's going on in Gaza, for example, or Sudan, but certainly Gaza, it seems just impossibly long. But the arc of history turns towards justice, I believe.
Yes and no. I mean, in the sense that, yes, it takes forever, and a lot of people die in between. And at the end, do you end up with some kind of a deal where justice goes off the table in order to just get some kind of a line underneath? But I do find, again, just taking a step back and looking at Israel, Gaza, it has taken a long time before the genocide word has become much more current, and more people are comfortable talking about it. But I think essentially because of the food situation. I mean, you can appreciate the need for a military campaign. You can appreciate the need to try to, whether you agree with it or not, you understand the arguments around military necessity and trying to attack Hamas. But to stop food from going in at all, and to see the levels of hunger, then you start to people have become far more engaged with the idea, the concept of genocide.
So without asking you to come into this, and I'd like you both to comment on Ehud Olmert's editorial this week. And Ehud Olmert was convicted, I think, of corruption, was Israeli prime minister, bit of a rotter, doesn't like Netanyahu. But he said, what we're doing in Gaza now is a war of extermination. Indiscriminate, limitless, cruel and criminal killing of civilians. Yes, Israel is committing war crimes. He didn't use the G word, but...
No.
Did that change your perspective on it at all, or is because you're looking at how the court will see it, and then I'll flick it to Robert?
Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference in terms of how the court perceives it. I look at it more in terms of is there a change in Israeli public opinion? Is there enough pressure put on? And what we know is that this war is partially being prosecuted in order to keep Netanyahu in power.
Yes.
It's his way of avoiding stepping down, where, who cares about the ICC charges? He has corruption charges against him that he is desperately trying to avoid at this point. And in order to stay in power, he needs to keep extreme right-wing members of the cabinet on board, and therefore a number of policies come as a result of that. It's the extreme right-wing who said there shall be no food. And then we've had I've got quotes publicly saying we will allow enough aid in to kind of stop people from arguing about this, but
we will pretend to deliver aid.
We will,
which is what it looks like to me at the moment.
Just enough to try to get essentially the Americans and everybody else off our backs who are starting to complain about things. So I see it very much in terms of internal Israeli politics, and that's fascinating because it will then play out in terms of policy. And but I do not see a fundamental shift of policy. Yes.
In Israel,
yes, of course, Israel.
You mean in Israel and the prosecution of this conflict?
Exactly, which means that there will. I'm writing a piece at the moment. What are the different crimes that could be charged at the ICC, and it's easier to say out of the whole Rome Statute, the basis
What
for
isn't?
the ICC, what isn't there. I think maybe they won't charge forced marriage. I don't think that we can have that as one of the crimes. Maybe not sexual slavery, but apart from that, every single other crime, practically everything that's listed in the Rome Statute seems to be being committed at the moment in one form or another.
Yes, gosh, that's very well put, Janet. I know there's people in our audience who will be fascinated by that. Robert, what do you make of that? I want to raise an issue that I might not raise with Janet because it's kind of difficult for her. But the Israeli ambassador to the UN today or last overnight accused the Security Council of supporting an anti-Semitic agenda and supporting Hamas. The counter to everything that Janet said and everything that's going on at the moment is frequently an appeal to the idea of anti-Semitism. And I know I'm bringing you into dangerous territory here. I apologise.
Weaponized to some degree by the Netanyahu government basically the Netanyahu government since the 7th of October has met any concern about the humanitarian situation within Gaza as some sort of anti-Semitic sentiment that is or alignment with Hamas. And that's very worrying because it reminds me, to draw a parallel, when the Soviet Union existed, Soviet authorities used to respond to any criticism of their political system as anti-Soviet. And sometimes you get those reflexes in the United States where people are making legitimate observations are accused of being anti-American. And now we have the use of anti-Semitism as a way of stifling any criticism of the government of the day. People are not having a go at Israel as a state necessarily. They are talking about Israel is a state, and it's behaving at the moment in a way which falls short of
what one expects
humanitarian law, and also it's acted with military impunity, and it falls short of the standards you expect with any military person would tell you of a well-run counter-terrorist campaign. One of the first things you do is you target very precisely. You certainly do not fail to make a distinction between civilians and militant targets that you perhaps want to bring to account for actions.
And let's also say, because I'm not somebody the person who said that I get all nervous in this. It's not about nervousness. It's about trying to be, the Israelis say, the IDF is being incredibly careful and so on. I think that's no longer the case because they've obliterated so much. And in fact, Thomas Friedman from the New York Times today wrote a rather good piece. I think I sent it to you, Robert, and I maybe shared it with you, Janet, as well, which I'm sure you read anyway, that this isn't doing no good for Jewry or for Israel. And I want to separate those two things because it is just beyond the pale what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's where
and I know where the expression "beyond the pale" came from. So, yeah, before anybody takes me
I think
up
the
on
intervention by the former Israeli Prime Minister does have strategic significance in Israeli politics because while his own record is far from untarnished for reasons you pointed out, I think there was, if you like, a consensus after the attack or the Hamas terrorist attack of the 7th of October. And that is, as Friedman points out in his article, breaking down.
Yes.
And it seems to me that for a long time, Netanyahu has argued that to the families of the hostages, whose plight is tragic, let's face it, if you're a member of your family and a member of your family is a hostage.
Unless they're American-Israeli double citizens, in which case Trump and Witkoff get them out directly by talking to Hamas without talking to Israel.
But it seems to me that the situation at the moment is delicately poised. Netanyahu, for a long time, has deflected to some degree criticism about prosecuting the war by saying, look, Hamas only responds to military pressure. But I think this intervention by the Prime Minister, and if you read his article, he suggests that what's happening at the moment is not really in the strategic interests of the country. So
or of international or of Jewry.
Yes.
which is a separate thing, but to some extent. But yeah, Janet, do you want to comment on that at all, on those points at all, or is that just I worry I'm taking you out into an area that's too difficult?
I think that all of us who comment in this field are conscious of what of that, the ease with which the term anti-Semitism has, as you put it, Robert, been weaponized and can be used against us. I am extremely careful as to, when I use the term Jews or Jewish, and when I use the term Israel, and try to maintain that separation, which I think is important. I'm also, but I am conscious of how difficult it makes us, how difficult it makes the commentary on this, where we really are just trying to do our best to explain,
Yes,
what is going on, what is happening, and it doesn't matter the religious or national background of any individual involved. It is just bad stuff that is happening, and that's really where I come down to in the end.
Yeah, good on you. Thank you. That's a very typically intelligent way to put it. I was really struck by the instantaneous claims of anti-Semitism behind the awful murder of two Israeli diplomats in Washington. And I noticed that a journalist that I follow called Ken Klippenstein discovered that there is absolutely no evidence that that person disliked or hated Jews or was anti-Semitic, but he really did object to what was going on in Gaza, and it was as far as he can tell, was an attack against an Israeli pair of people. But not that, which is not to justify it.
But Peter, I mean, you choose representatives of the Israeli state. No,
correct.
You choose to do it at or
true.
just in front of a Jewish space. No, I mean, there's so much that is not acceptable, and I stand very strongly to say what is absolutely not acceptable. I find myself treading a line, but there are, I would not use the term, but I'd be very careful on that.
No, I totally agree.
I would agree with everything Janet's just said, and I would add that such actions as the assassination of two Israeli public servants, they may not even agree with Mr. Netanyahu's policies.
Exactly.
If you're working as a public servant in an embassy, it actually plays into the hands of the Netanyahu government, who were able to immediately seize on that, the speed at which they seized on that and exploited the issue for political gain, to deflect, to take away pressure that was building up from some of Israel's traditional allies, such as Britain and such as Canada and other countries, which were demanding that Israel relax its humanitarian blockade. And in a sense, that act of assassinating two Israeli diplomats effectively took some of the pressure away.
Very good
government.
Point. Very.
So
Jesus, you could be a journalist with this kind of take on things, Robert. You could be a journalist with this kind of take. No, you're absolutely right, and you're right too, Janet. What I was meaning was more whether there was an anti-Semitic history behind the motivation of this person, and I would encourage people to take a look at the Ken Klippenstein. Let me also just mention, before we bring in Bernard, who's sitting there, I think probably near the airport or on his way to the airport, for a bit of a rant about New Zealand. M. Gessen, who is transitioning in various ways from being Masha Gessen, is in the New York Times today, along with Friedman, and I'd encourage you to look at both, and the links will be in the show notes, talking about the erosion of democracy that she experienced or of the potential for democracy in Russia, and how similar that is to the United States. And I think that one of the things that I would encourage our New Zealand audience to think about is to read those and think about what happens when New Zealand politicians question media, or when media doesn't actually do its job necessarily, and how quick it can be to erode some of these values. Look, thank you so much, Janet. It's very kind of you to be up so early. Thank you, and you're doing a wonderful job, and we'll have you on again, I hope.
Thank you very much. Look forward to it.
Asymmetrical haircuts. Robert, thank you as always.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Janet. Bye.
Bernard,
Bye.
how are you?
Kia ora. Good to see you.
I've already defamed you by saying earlier on in the show. Have you been listening to the show on the way? Has Lynn been feeding it to you, as it were?
Unfortunately, no. I've been focusing on the road. I'm well and truly parked and not a danger to myself or others.
Good.
That's good.
Because I raised this question that I had sent you the Matthew Hooton piece from the Herald last week about New Zealand being a poor country and not recognising it yet. And I thought actually many of the points that he made were similar to yours, except that you then came back to me and said, no. He just believes we shouldn't borrow and we're actually robust. Do you want to launch into a bit of a soliloquy?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with Matthew. I think New Zealand is a very rich country, and you only have to look at the stats on the value of all the assets owned by New Zealanders. The problem,
but they're mostly
is,
houses, aren't they, Bernard?
yes, and you could argue that those houses are overvalued, but they're certainly valued at a certain level by the banks, and those banks are effectively guaranteed by our government. And they continue to transact at values close to the ones that are telling us that we're worth a lot of money. Possibly our housing market's still worth around about $1.5 trillion. The point I'm making in opposition to Matthew is that we're choosing to be poor. We're choosing as a government and as a society not to invest resources that we could easily have, some of which are just sitting there idle, a couple of 100,000 people, depending on how you measure it, plus an awful lot of resources that are just sitting there idle, but they need to be mobilised with capital. And the tragedy is that there is $1 billion of capital that pension funds offer to the New Zealand government to use to invest in infrastructure and to improve the productivity of our people and our economy, and the government's choosing not to use it. Even though ratings agencies and pension funds are perfectly happy to lend the money to New Zealand, which does have a AA plus credit rating, which is a safe haven, not just politically, but in climate terms, and which has a young, fast-growing population, lots of natural resources, lots of social and what I'd call institutional resources. We do have a democracy still. It is admired, and we are mostly non-corrupt, and a lot of people want to come and live here. And so we should...
particularly under the golden visa that the National Party's relaunched.
That's right. And that will be an interesting debate in the election, and a decision for National to make about whether they choose to team up with New Zealand First again if they win, because New Zealand First is blocking National's desire to really open up the floodgates for foreign capital to come in and buy New Zealand's houses and land. And interestingly, the pressures are on the economy, in part because of the way that our housing market has become frozen with not enough sales going through because people aren't willing to clear the market with lower prices. And so that, in combination with the banks being, you could argue, artificially restricted by the Reserve Bank from lending heavily, means that when the government has chosen to restrict itself by not spending much, by stopping investment, then you're not seeing the sort of volume of cash fly around the economy that you need to get the economic growth that you're going to get. And that's why in the month of April, our services sector actually contracted, and that's more than 60% of our economy. And the Reserve Bank is still nervous about cutting interest rates too fast because of having its fingers burnt by the inflation breakout a couple of years ago. And so all of this means we're actually headed for, in my view, a double dip recession. If not in the
partly, is it how much of that is based on sentiment, Bernard? It's like it's another sentiment driven recession, isn't it?
Well, actually, the
or
recorded
attitude,
sentiment,
mood.
Yeah, the recorded sentiment in consumer and business confidence studies are actually reasonably positive. They're way below their long-term averages, but they're up from their lows. And what we're increasingly finding, not just here but overseas, is that consumer and business confidence surveys are becoming disconnected from what actually happens in the economy.
Yes.
Because they're being skewed by political debate.
That's exactly what I meant. That it's like we talk ourselves down, right?
Yeah, but in New Zealand we have some real reasons to be wary of investing and spending, and that's because real wages are still falling. We've got rising unemployment, and we also got numbers this week showing that employment actually fell again in April when it was supposed to be rebounding. And the government's job cuts and infrastructure go slow is really hitting the construction sector and the planning sector, and the uncertainties around public infrastructure, particularly transport, water, and hospitals, is really holding back the private sector. Remember, it's the public sector.
We don't have a Ministry of Works that would be doing it. Yeah, it's the private sector. It's the public sector that drives the private sector, right? Including in our old friend Kaingaora. So before you go away, Bernard, I got to ask you to say, if I send you my story, my long-awaited story that has been 3 months in the bloody working, I might need to get you to do a second pair of eyes. Do you want to explain to people what you're doing and where you're going and when you're going to be back, and that you're going to try and stay with us?
Yeah,
I did. So... I have. I hope I haven't interrupted a punchline on the. There's usually not a punchline in the soliloquy. I have to then ask you what your punchline on the soliloquy is.
The punchline on the soliloquy is that. Is that the government's strategy, and that's a pretty strong word to use, I'd call it tactics, around the economy and debt are failing, and that unless we see a significant rebound in the housing market soon, and I don't think we will, then the government's going to have to intervene and force or cajole the Reserve Bank into unleashing a stream of new credit from the banks into the housing market to get the economy going again, because it's not going to come from the private sector, and it's not going to come naturally from housing with the current settings around capital controls and lending controls.
It's the longest headline I've ever heard, Bernard. But is that why Adrian Orr left?
It's one of those broadsheet, big wide paper, long paper headlines.
Is that why Adrian Orr left?
Well, we don't know for sure, but we know that he had various meetings with the finance minister about those capital controls in the weeks before he left. We know that the government is unhappy with the tight capital controls, and that they've been lobbied aggressively by the banks to see them relaxed. And we know that there's enormous pressure from the real estate community and the construction community to unleash, particularly in rental property investor buying, which is currently being restricted by debt to income multiple controls. So that will be the thing to watch, I think, in the next 3 to 6 months, is when or if the Reserve Bank relents under pressure from the government to
excuse me, but no, we have an independent central bank. They're not under pressure. They've just lost their governor, but
yeah. Interestingly, they are independent policy, but it's less independent when it comes to so-called prudential policy.
Yeah. So Bernard, you're going away for a month, right? And we're going to try and keep doing this. You're going to edit or give me a second pair of eyes at the very least on my story. I think everybody here wishes you a happy trip to Europe and various exciting places with Mrs. Hickey.
Yes.
And shall I do the skateboarding dog now, or do you want to have a quick word before Simon cuts us all off?
Just a very quick word of thanks and for everyone's patience, and I look forward to continuing the Hoon every Thursday night at 5 o'clock. While we're travelling, Lynn and I are revisiting some special places from a couple of years where we renewed our marriage vows, and we are enjoying a summer away in some nice quiet places.
Yeah, renewing your marriage vows could be too much information, as all of our daughters would say.
No, we've shared this with our audience a couple of years ago, so it's all good.
I know. Look, you're looking very stylish as well. Now, a skateboarding dog is a Florida man story from Polk County, Florida. Sheriff Grady Judd said deputies shot and killed a man who charged deputies with garden shears and tried to grab a gun from the patrol vehicle just after he was attacked by an alligator while swimming across a lake. And of course, it is gruesome and awful and very sad because, of course, the person had some issues, as Rory Stewart would say, but very sad, but also could only happen in California, in Florida.
Yeah, Florida.
Bernard, have a great trip. See you next week.
Thank you
Otherwise,
very
I'll
much.
wing it again with these kids. And I'm very grateful to everybody, and particularly to Janet from The Hague, and to Robert, and of course Simon, our producer, and to you, our audience. Thanks very much.
Ka kite anō.